I followed my husband to a motel and recognized the woman who opened the door. I'd signed her death certificate 5 years ago. Turns out I was the only person in that room who didn't know she was still alive. My husband had known the whole time. He was still wearing his wedding ring. He was holding a paper bag of her prescriptions, the same drugstore bag every time, because it turned out he'd been doing this on the second Tuesday of every month for 5 years. 3 weeks before that night, I would have told you my marriage didn't need watching. I'm a nurse, 14 years in emergency medicine, the last 6 at Ashcombe General in Pittsburgh, which means I've spent my whole career learning to read a room in 4 seconds, who's lying about how they fell, who's about to code, who's 5 minutes from losing someone. I thought I could read my own house just as fast. 3 days before any of this started, a resident wanted to send a 26-year-old home from my bay with a diagnosis of anxiety and a pamphlet. I'd clocked her pulse ox trending down for 40 minutes while everyone else was watching a trauma come through the doors, and I made him recheck her before he signed anything. Because a hunch that costs you 90 seconds is always worth more than a discharge you have to walk back at 2 in the morning. It was a pulmonary embolism. She's alive because I've spent 14 years refusing to let anyone's decline become background noise, even when it's quiet, even when everyone around me is looking somewhere louder. I bring it up because it's the same instinct that eventually cracked my own marriage open. I don't know how to stop noticing what other people miss. I never learned how to turn it off just because the patient was my own house. I carry a notebook, $49 drugstore kind, black cover, wire spine. I started it my first year after I lost my first patient, a 19-year-old named Casey Doyle who coded in triage before I even got his name spelled right on the chart. I couldn't save him. I could at least remember him, so I wrote his first name and the date in careful handwriting like it mattered, because it did. Nobody else has ever read it, not my sister, not my husband. 61 names now across 4 notebooks, and I could recite every one from memory, because writing a name down slow is a different thing than watching it fly by on a chart. It's the only funeral most of them ever got, as far as I know. I was 19 when my mother died, and the notebook started 2 years after that, the same year I lost Casey, which wasn't really a coincidence. She'd spent 8 months telling doctors something was wrong, and 8 months of being told it was stress, it was her nerves, it was probably nothing, and then it was a Tuesday, and it was an aortic dissection, and it was over in 11 minutes in a waiting room where nobody had been watching her closely enough to notice she'd gone gray. I became a nurse so the next Ruth Kerrigan, who said something hurt, would have somebody in the room who actually listened. The notebook is what I do with the ones I couldn't save anyway. It's not morbid. It's the only promise I've never broken. My husband knows the notebook exists. He has never once asked to see it, which is one of maybe 400 reasons I married him. Julian runs a nonprofit called Harborline. Ask him what it does at a dinner party and he'll say relocation services and change the subject so smoothly most people don't notice they've been redirected. What it actually does, what I understood, in the vaguest terms, for 6 years of marriage, is help women disappear from men who are going to kill them, and start over somewhere those men will never find them. He never brings the work home, never a name, a city, a case number. I used to think that was privacy. I used to think that was the job. I remember one night, years ago, before any of this, telling him about a patient over dinner. I wasn't supposed to, no name, no chart number, just a feeling I couldn't put down. A woman who kept coming back in with injuries that didn't match her stories, who flinched when I touched her wrist, who told me calmly that she couldn't leave because leaving was more dangerous than staying, and she was probably right, and I didn't know what to do with that. Julian went quiet for a long time. Then he asked me carefully which night she usually came in. I told him I couldn't say. He said that was the right answer and never brought it up again, and I forgot about it completely, the way you forget one bad shift among 1,000. I didn't think about that dinner again for 5 years. I'm going to come back to it, because it turns out I should have. Julian is not a man who hides things by nature. He remembers how my coffee order changes with the seasons. He learned to sit through opera because I like it badly once a year. 8 years ago, on our second date, a man at the bar next to me got handsy after I'd told him twice to back off, and Julian, who is not a large man, who has never once raised his voice at me, stood up so fast his chair went over, got between us and said low and flat, "If you ever put your hands on her again, I will make sure it's the last thing you remember clearly." Then he sat back down and asked if I wanted dessert, like nothing had happened. 3 months into knowing me, he told me that if I were ever in real trouble, the kind that doesn't go away with a phone call. He would tear the whole world apart before he let it touch me. I believed him. I still believe him. That's part of what made the last 3 weeks so unbearable. Not that I thought he'd stopped being that man, that I thought he'd turned it toward someone else. The Tuesday it actually started, we were 3 bites into takeout on the kitchen floor, because the dining chairs were at the upholsterer and neither of us could be bothered to eat standing up. Julian was doing the bit where he narrates dinner like a nature documentary, and here the wild pad see ew returns to its natural habitat, my mouth, and I was laughing hard enough that I almost missed his phone buzzing face down on the tile beside him. He didn't miss it. He glanced at the screen for less than a second and set it back down without answering, still narrating, still doing the voice. 20 minutes later it buzzed again. This time he stood up mid-sentence, said give me 1 second, and took it into the hallway low-voiced, his back to me. I didn't think anything of it. That's the part I keep circling back to. I finished my noodles. I refilled both our waters. When he came back he picked the documentary bit up exactly where he'd left it, and I laughed again, and if you'd asked me that night whether my marriage needed watching, I would have laughed at that too. It started small enough that I almost didn't notice it starting. A Tuesday shift that ran late for no reason he'd explain beyond work. Another Tuesday, not 2 weeks later. I only clocked the pattern because running schedules is my whole job and patterns are the entire skill. A phone I didn't recognize, charging in the center console of his car, that disappeared into the glove box the one time I mentioned it. Cash, $400 the first week, $400 again the second, pulled from an ATM nowhere near either of our jobs. We were fine, on the surface. Better than fine, actually, which nobody tells you is the part that makes betrayal in a good marriage so disorienting. It doesn't replace the good marriage, it runs underneath it, like a second show playing on the same screen. He still made me the same terrible coffee every morning, too strong, exactly how I like it. We still did the Sunday thing, where he burns the toast on purpose because I told him once, half joking, that the smell made me feel like a kid again, my mother in the kitchen. And he never forgot it. 6 years of slightly charred bread, like a small standing apology to a woman he never met. Hold both of those things at once. The burnt toast and the disappearing phone. That's what the next 3 weeks actually felt like. My sister Margot Kerrigan has been divorced 4 years, and she has a theory about everything now. When I told her about the phone, she didn't let me finish the sentence. That's the tell, she said. Mine did the glove box thing too. You want to know how I found out for sure? I stopped asking and started checking. I told her Julian wasn't like that. She said that's what she used to say too, right up until she wasn't saying it anymore. Our anniversary was 6 weeks out. 10 days into noticing things, I finally pulled up the credit card statement, which I am not proud of, except that I am a little, because it turned out to matter. 6 charges over 5 months, same vendor, $89 each, a place called the Colonial Court Motel off Route 30, 40 minutes outside the city, the kind of place with a neon sign missing 1 letter and a lobby that smells like a different decade. Hourly rooms were not, as far as 3 separate review sites could tell me, the specialty of the Colonial Court Motel, which somehow made it worse, not better. A hotel built for an affair I could have almost respected. A rundown motel 40 minutes from anywhere either of us had a reason to be felt colder. There was a receipt in his jacket pocket a few days later, the kind you're not supposed to go looking for, and I went looking for it. A jewelry store downtown. 1 item, no description beyond SKU number $1,100. I never got a necklace. I checked every drawer, every jacket, the glove box, telling myself I'd stop the second I found nothing. I found something instead, less than a week after that, and it made less sense than the necklace, which somehow made it worse. His real phone lit up on the counter while he was in the shower, a message from a contact saved only as E. The transfer window closes Friday. Tell him to be ready to move her again if it doesn't clear. I stood there holding a dish towel, reading that sentence 4 times, my chest going tight and hot the way it does right before I have to tell a family something they don't want to hear. Move her again. I decided, standing in my own kitchen, that my husband was laundering money for a woman named E, or worse, and that at least explained why none of it looked exactly like romance. It just looked like something I had no part in. I didn't confront him, not yet, and I want to be honest about why. It wasn't strength. Some old, stupid, hopeful part of me still believed that saying it out loud would make it permanently true, the way saying a diagnosis out loud to a family makes it real for them in a way the chart never quite does. So I did what I do at work when something doesn't add up and I'm not ready to escalate. I watched. I waited. I told myself I was gathering data before I did anything I couldn't take back. 3 weeks in, almost to the day, a card alert hit my phone at 8:52 p.m. On a Tuesday, Colonial Court Motel, $89, while Julian was supposedly 40 minutes away at an emergency board call he'd mentioned that morning, almost too casually, the way you mention something you've rehearsed. I didn't decide to follow him so much as discover I was already in the car, the alert still glowing in the cup holder, my hands doing something my brain hadn't fully signed off on yet. The Colonial Court has 14 rooms, a gravel lot, and a vending machine out front that hums louder than it should. His car was the only one I recognized, parked crooked outside room 6, like he'd stopped caring how it looked, which should have told me something, though I didn't understand what until later. I sat in my own car for 11 minutes. Then I got out and knocked, because some idiot, exhausted, terrified part of me needed to see it with my own eyes instead of imagining it for the rest of my life. The door opened and a woman I hadn't seen in 5 years looked back at me. I want to tell you I recognized her instantly. The truth is slower and worse. First I registered the shape of a stranger's face doing something familiar. Then the particular tilt her jaw. Then, all at once, the way a diagnosis clicks into place after you've been staring at the wrong symptom too long, her name, whole, unbidden. Rosalind. I'd written it in my second notebook, careful handwriting, next to a date in February, 5 years ago. I didn't need to check the page. I knew the date the way I know my own birthday, Rosalind. February the 9th, I'd been the nurse who charted her time of death. She stood in front of me alive in a bathrobe that wasn't hers, holding the doorknob so hard her knuckles had gone white. My ears went hot first, then my hands, like my body couldn't decide which alarm to sound. Behind her, in a room with 2 coffee cups and a half-eaten sandwich, and my husband's jacket over the back of a chair, Julian was already standing, already saying my name in a voice I'd never heard him use, not guilty, afraid for someone who wasn't me. Sloane. He said it like a door closing gently on something about to make noise. You need to come inside, and you need to be quiet, and I promise I'll explain everything. But not one word out here, please. He never once said the words "it's not what it looks like." That scared me more than if he had. I went inside. Rosalind. I still hadn't said her name out loud, holding it like it might vanish if I let it out of my mouth, back toward the window and pulled the curtain a half-inch, checking the lot the way you check a lot when you've spent years learning that a certain kind of car means a certain kind of ending. Her hands were shaking, not the shake of a woman caught in an affair, the shake of a woman who'd been waiting 5 years for a knock on a motel door to be the wrong one. There's a car, she said to Julian, not to me, silver, parked across the road since about 7, hasn't moved. Julian went still in a way I recognized from exactly one other place, the way I go still at work when a monitor does something I don't like and I haven't decided yet whether to say it out loud. Since 7, he repeated. Before Sloane got here. Before you got here, Rosalind said. I didn't understand yet what that meant, only that the temperature of the room had changed, and whatever fight I'd driven 40 minutes to have wasn't the one actually happening. I signed your death certificate, I said to her, because it was the only true thing I had. February 9th. Cardiac arrest, unwitnessed collapse, resuscitation attempted for 31 minutes. I wrote your name in a notebook I've never shown anyone, because you were the one I couldn't save that month, and I have thought about your face more times than I can count in 5 years. And you're standing in a motel room drinking coffee with my husband. Rosalind looked at Julian. Something in his face gave way, like a decision he'd been holding shut for 5 years had finally lost its grip. She's not who you think, he said. Neither am I. I need 10 minutes before that car outside becomes a problem, and I need you to trust me for those 10 minutes even though I haven't earned it tonight. After that, I'll tell you everything. I promise you that. I said yes, because whatever this was, it wasn't the thing I'd built in my head for 3 weeks. And some part of me, the nurse part, the part that reads a room in 4 seconds, already understood the car outside mattered more right now than my own breaking heart. What happened in the next 20 minutes happened fast, and I'm only going to tell you what I actually witnessed, because I've learned what it costs to fill gaps with guessing. Julian made 2 calls, low and quick, using words I didn't understand yet, a secondary location, a check-in window, a name, Owen, said like a man he trusted with his life. Rosalind packed a bag that was already half-packed, like she'd rehearsed this exact 5 minutes more times than anyone should have to. I did the only useful thing I know how to do under pressure, which is stay calm and keep my hands moving. I checked her pulse without being asked, some reflex I couldn't have stopped if I'd tried, found it running fast and thin, and told her to breathe through her nose for a count of 4. She did. Some part of both of us was grateful to have a job instead of a feeling to survive. The silver car pulled away 4 minutes before we did. Julian didn't relax until he watched its taillights merge onto the highway going the wrong direction. And even then his jaw stayed tight the whole drive to what he called the secondary location, a modest rental 40 minutes further out, that looked from the street exactly like every other house on it, which by then I understood was the entire point. Rosalind didn't say much on the drive, until we stopped at a red light on an empty road and she said, out of nowhere, I have tomatoes coming in, second week of the season. I was going to bring some to the woman 2 doors down, the one who waters my ferns when I travel for work. She said it like she was testing whether the sentence still made sense out loud. I have a job. I have a library card with my name on it. Her name. Nora's name. I've had a whole life for 5 years that nobody in this car actually knows anything about, and I am so tired of being the reason people I've never met have to disappear too. I asked her, carefully, why she'd never just gone to the police at the start, instead of a non-profit run out of motel rooms. She laughed short and without much humor in it. Desmond's fraternity roommate is a sitting judge 2 counties over. His college roommate runs the largest paper in the state. I filed 3 reports in 4 years. 2 of them disappeared before they were ever assigned a detective. The 3rd one got back to him in 9 hours, and that was the week he put me in the hospital for real. The first time, before the second time got a death certificate attached to it. She said it flatly, the way I say things at work when the alternative is not saying them at all. He told me the truth in that kitchen, starting a little after midnight, and it took most of the night. Some of it he told me himself. The parts he wasn't in the room for I only understood later from Owen Marsh directly, months after, in a diner 2 towns over, because I needed the version that didn't come filtered through my husband. I'm going to tell it the way Owen told it to me, from inside a night I was never shown the last 90 seconds of. 9:14 p.m., February the 9th, Rosalind Calloway arrived by ambulance in cardiac arrest, logged as an accidental overdose. It wasn't accidental and it wasn't the first time. Her husband, Desmond Calloway, owned 4 hotels and 1 state senator by then, and had spent 9 years making sure every call for help she made got quietly redirected, before it reached anyone who could act on it. She'd reached Harborline 11 weeks earlier, through a channel careful enough to leave almost no trace, a burner phone, a code phrase, 1 meeting at a library 2 counties over. Owen Marsh had lost his own sister to a man exactly like Desmond a decade before he ever met Julian Reyes, and when Harborline asked if he'd try something the organization never had, he said yes before they finished the question. If Rosalind ever coded for real on his watch, he would call it on the record permanently. While a young charge nurse ran compressions in Trauma Bay 2, doing everything right on a chart that would end up telling the truth and nothing but the truth, a second team was already moving in a supply hallway 40 feet away, off the books, in a room the hospital's own cameras had a documented, boring maintenance gap in for exactly that shift, arranged days earlier by someone on Harborline's payroll, who did nothing more dramatic than file a work order. Julian was in that hallway, so for the first time in the operation's history, was Eleanor, because she didn't trust anyone else to make the call if it went wrong. It nearly did. Rosalind's heart didn't restart on the first attempt, or the second. It came back faint and uneven 11 minutes after a nurse 2 doors away had already stopped counting and started filling out a time of death. That nurse was me. I didn't understand that the first time Owen told it. For a few seconds I genuinely thought he meant someone else's shift, until I understood slowly he'd been describing mine the whole time, my hands, my chart. My 11 minutes of believing I'd lost her, running exactly parallel to 11 minutes in a hallway I never even knew existed. Desmond buried his wife in a plot with his family name on it and gave a eulogy that made the local paper. 400 words about a devoted marriage that made me a little sick to reread once I understood what it was covering. Rosalind spent 5 years as a woman named Nora, in 3 different states, checked on every second Tuesday by a man who'd promised, the night they pulled her out, that she'd never go a month without someone confirming in person that she was still breathing. That was the prescriptions. That was the $89 charges. I learned that night was Eleanor. The transfer window was legal, not criminal, a filing deadline before a judge's docket changed and a property record neither of them controlled would have made the current safe house traceable. Moving her again meant exactly what it said. Nothing more sinister than a woman's whole life riding on a paperwork deadline. I'd built into a money laundering plot out of nothing but fear and a bad night's imagination. The necklace was real, and it was mine. He'd bought it weeks earlier for our anniversary and never gave it to me, because by the time the date arrived, Rosaline's case had gone sideways in 1 week and he'd forgotten it existed in a drawer at his office until I asked him about it weeks later, in a very different tone than I meant to use. And that dinner, years ago, the one where I mentioned a patient without meaning to, no name, no chart number, just a feeling I couldn't put down about a woman who flinched when I touched her wrist. Julian asked which night she usually came in. I told him I couldn't say, and he told me that was the right answer, and I forgot about it. What I didn't know until that kitchen at 1 a.m, 5 years later, was that the woman I couldn't thinking about that one ordinary Tuesday was Rosalind. I had put her on Harborline's radar 11 weeks before she ever coded on my table, without knowing her name, without knowing what I'd started. Then I'd walked into that ER on February the 9th and lost a patient I had already, completely by accident, completely without credit, tried once to save. Julian hadn't known how to tell me that without breaking every rule Harborline runs on. So he'd told me nothing at all for 5 years and let me believe, if I ever noticed anything, that the worst explanation was the true one, because the true one wasn't only his to give away. I didn't forgive him standing in that kitchen. Not completely, not yet. I told him the not knowing had cost me something real, 3 weeks of believing myself unloved in my own home, and that a good enough reason for a lie doesn't erase what living inside it actually felt like. He didn't argue with that. He said he'd spent 5 years choosing between 2 kinds of hurting me, the temporary kind, if I ever found out and had to sit with a truth this heavy, or the kind that gets someone killed if it leaks even once, even to someone he trusted completely, because trust isn't the same as an airtight secret. He said he'd learned that from someone who'd made the opposite choice, a long time before he knew me. That someone was his mother. Eleanor Reyes founded Harborline 19 years ago, before Julian was old enough to understand what she actually did with the family's money instead of donating it to a museum wing like everyone assumed. She is, by every account including her son's, the reason the organization hasn't lost a client to a leak in nearly 2 decades. The reason for that record has a name. Carol Whitfield was the first client Harborline ever extracted, when the whole operation was 3 volunteers and a spreadsheet. She died 8 months into her new life, after her own sister, meaning nothing but love, mentioned an unusual detail in an unguarded phone call to the wrong old friend. Eleanor identified the body. She has run every case since as though it were the only thing standing between the next Carol and the same ending. I understand now why she is the way she is. I still don't excuse what she did to me. She showed up at the rental house 4 days after that night at the Colonial Court, and she did not say hello. She looked at me the way you look at a fire alarm going off for no reason you can find yet, and said, "You were never supposed to be part of this. You were supposed to be the wife who didn't ask questions, and instead you followed my son 40 minutes down a highway and knocked on a door." I told her I hadn't gone looking for a secret, I'd gone looking for my marriage. "Then you should have trusted it," she said, instead of a credit card statement. That wasn't enough for her apparently, because she kept going, flat and cold and clearly rehearsed on the drive over. "Your name is on that death certificate, Sloan. Not mine. Not my son's." 1 phone call to the state board, 1 anonymous tip about irregularities in a 5-year-old chart, and it's your license that gets pulled while you're still explaining a decision you didn't even know you were part of. I'd hate for you to learn the hard way that discretion isn't optional in this family. Julian was in the doorway before she finished the sentence. In 6 years I had never seen his face do what it did in that moment. Not anger exactly, something colder and more finished. The look of a man watching someone he loves reveal a shape he'd spent his whole life hoping wasn't really there. "You are not going to threaten my wife in a house I'm standing in," he said, very quiet, which I have since learned is worse than loud, coming from him. "You built this organization to keep people from feeling exactly what you just made her feel. Say that again and you can explain to the board why I'm done." Eleanor left without another word. I stood in that kitchen with my hands shaking in a way that had nothing to do with a code, and everything to do with being threatened, calmly by my own mother-in-law, over paperwork I'd filled out in good faith 5 years before any of us knew what we were part of. I didn't scream. I didn't cry, not yet. I did what I do at work when a situation is bigger than my feelings about it. I got quiet and I started making a list. I've spent 6 years learning exactly how a hospital records, audits, and amends a chart. I know what a legitimate late correction looks like, filed properly with a documented clinical reason, versus what a falsified record looks like under a state audit. Sitting at that kitchen table at 2 in the morning, I understood that Eleanor's threat only worked if she assumed I'd sit still and wait to find out which one mine would be treated as. I decided that night I wasn't going to be the wife who didn't ask questions, or the nurse who waited to be investigated. I called Owen Marsh in the morning and told him everything, then asked him to help me file a documented, honest, narrow amendment not erasing what I'd charted, which was true as far as I knew it, but formally noting, through the hospital's own legitimate correction process, that portions of the resuscitation record from that date required review under a since-closed quality assurance matter. Every word of that sentence was accurate. It would survive any audit, because it was the record of a nurse who'd done her job honestly inside a situation she was never told the whole truth about. Owen agreed before I finished asking. He told me later he'd been waiting 5 years for someone to let him do something honest with what he knew. I thought that was the hardest part. I was wrong. Margot called twice that week, and both times I told her work was slow and I was tired, which was the first real lie I'd told her since our mother got sick and I hadn't wanted to say the word out loud yet. She wasn't fooled. "You sound different," she said the second call. "Did you leave him?" "You can tell me if you finally left him." I told her I hadn't left him. She went quiet in a way that meant she didn't believe the rest of what I wasn't saying either. And for the first time in my life I understood exactly how Julian must have felt every single Tuesday for 5 years, holding a truth that would only make the people you loved more scared, not less, and calling that mercy instead of what it actually was, which was just a different flavor of alone. 9 days after the colonial court, I was at the rental house with Rosalind. We'd started calling her Rosalind again, between the 4 of us, like giving her name back was the first real thing anyone had done for her in years, when Julian's phone rang at 11:40 at night. A number he didn't recognize. A man's voice said only, "Tell your mother the silver car found the house," and hung up before Julian could answer. For 6 minutes, none of us knew if that was a threat, a warning, or a trap, and I have never felt time move the way it moved in those 6 minutes. Rosalind went straight to the back bedroom and came out with a bag already zipped. Harborline trains every client on exactly this, she told me later, a bag packed from day one, because you don't get to choose in advance which night is the night. Watching her hands move without a single wasted motion, I understood she had never once been the person this story needed to rescue. She'd been surviving on her own competence for 5 years. We were just the people lucky enough to be standing near her when it counted. 6 minutes doesn't sound like very long until you spend it standing in a dark kitchen with your palm flat against a woman's back, both of you counting her breathing out loud, because it's the only thing either of us knew how to do that felt like control. I found myself doing math I hadn't done since nursing school, minutes to the county line, exits between here and the highway, whether the back door still stuck the way it had the last time we'd tried it. Julian stood at the front window with the lights off, phone in one hand, the other flat against the frame, like he could feel a car coming through the glass before he saw it. Nobody said the word if. Headlights swung into the driveway at 11:52, not the silver car, a sedan I didn't recognize, and a man got out alone, unhurried, in a way that was somehow worse than if he'd been running, and walked up the driveway like he already knew exactly which house was ours. He didn't get past the porch. Harborline had put a basic security system into every safe house 11 months earlier, after a near miss at a different property Julian had never told me about: cameras, a silent alert to a private security contractor on retainer, a motion light bright enough to make the man flinch and half raise a hand against it. 2 men were out of an unmarked car and had him against the porch rail before he finished explaining, badly, that he was lost. He wasn't lost. He had a folder in his jacket with 3 surveillance photos of Rosalind taken over the past 2 weeks, and a text still open on his phone, a payment amount and an address, sent 4 days earlier from a number that traced, inside 48 hours, straight back to an account controlled by Desmond Calloway. That was the piece nobody could bury. Not a rumor 5 years old and hard to prove, a live, current, documented conspiracy to locate a woman a wealthy, connected man had publicly mourned as dead for half a decade. Once that photograph existed, once that payment trail existed, there was no version of the story where Desmond's lawyers could make it disappear, Because it wasn't about 5 years ago anymore. It was about a man he'd hired 4 days before it turned into evidence. The county DA's office opened a case within the week: stalking, conspiracy, and a fraud charge tied to a death benefit Desmond had quietly collected on a policy that, as far as any insurer's paperwork was concerned, had never technically been voided. He'd let that lie sit on the books and collect interest for half a decade rather than correct it, which turned out to be its own crime, cleaner and easier to prove than anything involving a hospital chart. He's out on bail as I write this, waiting for a trial that will not be quiet. For the first time in 5 years, that's the plan. Eleanor came to the rental house one more time, 3 weeks later, and this time she didn't come to threaten anyone. Julian had told her, in terms I only heard about secondhand, but which apparently left no room for negotiation, that Harborline's next chapter would include a second set of eyes on every threat assessment that touched a client's family, his phrase. Procedural. The kind of sentence you write when you've decided a person you love can't be trusted alone with certain decisions anymore, even if that person is your mother. Eleanor stood in the doorway of a kitchen that wasn't hers and told me, without quite managing to look at me while she said it, that she'd been wrong to threaten me. That fear had made her cruel in a way she'd apparently decided, 19 years into this work, was simply the cost of doing it right. She said she was sorry, a word I don't think she says often. I told her I understood why she'd built herself that way. I told her that didn't mean I'd forgotten what she said to me in that first kitchen, and that trust spent gets rebuilt slowly or not at all, and the choice was hers now, not mine. She nodded like a woman taking notes. Rosalind is in a 4th state now, one I'm not going to name even here, out of a habit I suspect I'll never fully unlearn. She sends Julian a single word by text every second Tuesday, just here, nothing else, and he shows it to me now, every time, not because I ask but because he decided somewhere in the last few months that a marriage doesn't survive on being handed only the parts that are safe to know. I told Margaret a version of it, eventually, enough to be true, not enough to be dangerous. A colleague of Julian's needed somewhere safe for a while, I said, and I'd gotten scared imagining the worst, and the worst wasn't what it looked like. She didn't push for the rest, which surprised me, until she said, I don't actually need the whole story, Sloane. I just needed to know you weren't lying to me the way I used to lie to myself. I told her I understood that better than I had 3 months ago. She let it go after that, mostly, except for one text a few weeks later that just said, tell your husband I take back what I said about the glove box thing, which is as close as my sister gets to an apology. 6 weeks after the colonial court, I sat down with the 4th notebook, the one that still has 40 empty pages, and I wrote a new entry, not a name and a date of loss. For once, alive. I sat there a long time looking at those 2 words, because in 14 years and 61 names, I had never once written anything in that notebook that wasn't a small, private funeral. Julian found me at the table with it still open. He didn't ask to read it, which he never does. He set the necklace box down next to my hand instead, 3 months late, no ribbon. Like he couldn't decide if it still counted as a gift or just an apology wearing a gift's shape, and put his other hand flat on the table beside mine, not touching, just close. I told you once I'd tear the world apart before I let anything touch you, he said. I never said that was the only promise like it I'd ever made. I just never told you the others were real too. I know that now, I said. Are we all right? I thought about the notebook, and the burnt toast, and 11 minutes in a hallway I never saw, and a woman who packed her own bag in the dark without waiting for anyone to save her. We're gonna be, I said. I already believe you. I'm just still learning what else you never told me, one Tuesday at a time. He didn't flinch from that. A man with something left to hide flinches when you say a sentence like that out loud. Julian just nodded like a man relieved to finally be building something honest, one Tuesday at a time in the daylight, with no motel required. I still fill that notebook with names I couldn't save. That part hasn't changed and I don't want it to. It just isn't only that anymore. Did she go far enough or was she still too merciful? Comment justice if the ending was perfect. Comment harder if you want an even colder revenge. Your comments decide how ruthless the next ending should be. Like and subscribe if you want to be here for the next story.